Welcome to Out of the Woods, the threat hunting podcast.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to welcome everyone to our Out of the Woods Threat Hunting live Discord interactive podcast. This aims at covering the burning topics relating to all threat hunting and security stuff that you want to know about. And this episode is going to be kind of different than ones in the past, but I think it'll be a lot of fun. So just a reminder, throughout the podcast, we'll be taking comments and questions from our Discord server. If you want to participate, make sure to sign up using the link in the welcome message. So some brief introductions. I'm Scott Poley. You can check me out on LinkedIn to kind of check out my background and experience. And then we've got Mike, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hey, I'm Mike. Same thing. I'm on LinkedIn. Check me out if you'd like to.
And then we got Lee Arcanal.
How's it going? I'm everywhere. Take a look at LinkedIn, see what I do. Yeah.
And I think we're gonna pull up Discord so we can track on the feed here.
Yeah, Lee, do you want to pull up and share Discord real quick? So just so everyone knows, and when we do these live podcasts, we always feature a special cocktail that's cyber themed. This podcast this week is the Cyber Sentinel. So at the end, if you're drinking along with us, trying the drink, that's great. Give us some feedback. Special note about this one, we actually let ChatGPT help us create it. So you kind of see if you think that it did a good job or not. So what I mentioned about this being a special podcast or edition of this, we're going to really dive into ChatGPT, and we're going to do two different sections. The first is we're going to kind of do a bake-off. I have already had some conversations with ChatGPT on some generalized security questions, and we're going to see how Mike and Lee fare, what their opinions are, and then kind of compare and contrast between ChatGPT and the guys. And then we're going to move on to how we think ChatGPT has helped us in our day-to-day and career in cybersecurity, and share some really cool tricks and tips utilizing ChatGPT. So with that, let's dive into the us versus it section. So the first question that I dug into with ChatGPT was, what is the most important technical role in cybersecurity and why? What do you think, Mike?
Oh, all right, I'll kick this off. Man, this is stressful. So I'm a little biased coming from my experience. I was a security engineer to start my career in cybersecurity, and I think that is a very important and very technical role within the cybersecurity realm. So from a security engineering's perspective, you have to understand the kind of the network, the infrastructure, the architecture, potentially policies. You have to enact a lot of those policies in your process. And as you're designing and building that architecture, typically those individuals work very closely with the analysts and other groups within cybersecurity to make sure you're building the right capabilities. They also work with developers. They also work with, kind of the front-end policymakers and managers and kind of the higher ups that are designing the whole architecture. So again, I'm a little biased, but I feel like that's in my mind the most technical role, as well as being able to build and script and program, and potentially those people know Python or some other type of scripting language. So that's my super quick answer, so I don't get crushed by ChatGPT.
What do you think, Lee?
I have to agree with Mike. So on the back end, you have the people managing the tools and engineering. As an analyst and a threat hunter, which I would love to say, yeah, threat hunter, but ChatGPT is really good at finding new information and regurgitating what already exists. As an engineer,
right,
you have to go into a unique environment that is unique to you, figure out how all the puzzle pieces fit, put them together, and maintain it. I haven't tested ChatGPT about errors, like, hey, what if I get this error or stuff? But if that error is unique to a situation that you're in, ChatGPT might have a vague recommendation, but at the end of the day, it's going to take the engineer to sit there and solve the problem. So I have to say engineer, because they're the one maintaining the tools, the architecture, everything that we're using to be successful. So that's my point.
So interestingly enough, when I asked ChatGPT, one of the things I've learned with using ChatGPT functions like this is it always regurgitates just a big list of things a lot of times, but it's always really good to prompt it to try to sort it in some sort of order you care about. And it will actually do a better job of giving you a list you care about. So when I sent out the question in the list, it mentioned security analyst, network system administrator, penetration tester, incident responder, and security architect. And then I had the same thought. I was like, man, I wonder where threat hunter fits in this, because that's kind of what we're all about. So then I kind of gave it the pivot question on, what about threat hunting? And it said that it was more of a specialized version of either security analyst or incident responder. And I feel like that's kind of how a lot of people treat threat hunting too. So it kind of made sense to me where everyone kind of shoes and, we'll do threat hunting here as part of a dual role, right? Or it shares some of the same skill sets of both, right? So once I kind of prompted with threat hunting, then I asked it to organize what roles were the most important. It actually said security architect is one, which I thought was a pretty good answer when you think about when you mention engineering. I feel like it kind of falls in line with that, right? Like engineers is like, I feel like just a substep under that. Architects are kind of really thinking big picture process. Engineers are like what to do with everything and make it work. But it actually put threat hunting second after I had the kind of conversation with it. So I thought that was interesting. So
biased ChatGPT.
Well, I may have influenced it, but I definitely gave threat hunting a category for it to consider. And I think why it probably put it above some of the other roles it previously mentioned was because it's more specialized. And if it covers down on 2 roles, it obviously would be better to have than not have one of the other roles, because they can cover down on those as well with the skill sets and things. So I thought that was interesting.
So should we take a quick small step back and just talk about how ChatGPT builds these models and these responses? I think is kind of important for the next set of questions we're going to ask it, right? So it's been scraping the internet and it tries to compile, the responses based on the data that it gets. And so it's interesting enough, if you start to ask things in the 2022, 2023 kind of lexicon,
pre-2021,
really know how to answer, right? Yeah. And so it's interesting, right? Like I wouldn't have a job today. I wouldn't have a job as a security engineer if I didn't know how to Google things and find the answers and kind of do some logic puzzles around how to find what these errors mean. And so this is a really good way to kind of culminate that data together. But I think it's important to understand how it kind of builds these models and presents the data back.
So I do want to say, I also agree with ChatGPT when it talks about a threat hunter being considered a specialized type of security analyst or incident responder. Talking to the different customers that we do and feeling out, where I've been, my experiences from security or SOC analyst and incident responder to threat hunter, you have to have that understanding of what's going on and how to correlate logs and look at relationships between events once something has happened. If you're in an organization that has an IR process and procedure that exists already, then I think you can elevate to have threat hunters be pulled from that group. I don't think you could do it the opposite way, and I don't think you would want to do it the opposite way, to be fair. Like if you have a bunch of threat hunters just searching for data or maliciousness, and you don't have an incident responders, then guess what? You are now a threat hunter incident responder. I think it's like one of those things that you knew, but once you saw it in words, it was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like that just clicks.
Yeah.
Would you say that kind of threat hunter is a blend of a security engineer and an analyst from a understanding of the environment type perspective, right? It takes both of those skill sets to be a really good threat hunter.
I wish, but I think Alex
would say,
because I'm always like, Alex, help. Alex, I need this. Alex.
I would say the skill sets that reside in an engineer, an analyst, and an incident responder, like if you can fill, if you're able to maybe not be the best at any one of those roles, but you could fill all 3 of them, you're probably a decent threat hunter.
Yep.
Right? That's kind of how I look at it.
The jack of all trades. We know how to do a lot of stuff well.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump to the next one. So the next question, guys, you're gonna get hit with is, if you only do one thing to protect an organization, what is the most important thing you should do?
2-factor authentication.
Lee, kick it off.
Take your
answer?
Yeah, so hear me out. Wait, time out. Are we talking about like are security controls in place and then we got some, or is it just like we have an organization that's flat and we need
So
some?
it's interesting you brought that up because ChatGPT just kind of looked at it as a broad thing because it is usually broad unless you make it specific. So think of that as far as your answer. Not a bad answer though.
I would say, man, so, okay, I'm thinking new organization, we move to the cloud, 2FA. I'm going to stick with it because
All right.
that's just what I'm doing.
First answer is your best answer. I like
Yep.
it. Go with your gut. Scott,
We
you
got,
wanna go? Or are you gonna just prompt?
I already know the answer, or I know their answer, so it's not really fair.
All right. So again, I'm thinking from the kind of the core infrastructure architecture perspective. I'm gonna say zero trust. I'm gonna say separation of kind of enclaves or security environments, right? So I say zero trust because it is a concept. It's a buzzword, right? Like we're about to go to RSA. Maybe it's gonna be the
That's
thing
just what I
there.
say. We have the RSA website.
No, but you got to think about it. So it was a security concept, zero trust,
Yep.
right? It's something that we've always learned and understood as a concept in security. It became a product because somebody figured out how to productize it and build it into tools and more physical process. So that as a core, I feel like is the best way to think about security, right? So it kills kind of lateral movement. It can kill a lot of the tactics and techniques that malware uses if you get to a place and you're just cut off, because you can't escalate privilege, you can't maneuver an environment. So that's what we go with, zero trust. And ChatGPT said, drum roll please.
So interestingly enough, it started out with kind of how if you were going to start a security program, and it started out with building a security strategy. They're saying that was the most important thing, probably because if you don't have a strategy in place, how are you going to build into other areas? I kind of felt like that was your traditional cop out too. Like, okay, we were thinking more along the lines like, gosh, if you only had to do one thing or you could do one thing, that kind of opened the door for now you can do many things with this one thing, right? But I did try to like make it pivot and go to like, well, what's the runner up? Thinking there might be something more specific. And it went right to a robust risk management plan or risk management type thing. So, I mean, once again, it's kind of hitting the top two things that maybe a security group should have or within the org. But I asked it for what technical thing, and I did agree with this, or I do feel like this is a very common answer. If you went away from strategy and planning, what technical thing would you do? And it said basically patching and updating software and systems. I thought that was a pretty good answer.
It sounded like the first two answers were straight from the CISSP Common Book of Knowledge.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
It's on the internet, right?
Right. So yeah, so we have these polls going on. We're kind of curious, who likes what answer better. If they like ChatGPT or none or whatever that goes. So feedback will be interesting.
The poll was.
See if I can get this to copy. Not going to insert it in, but you'll see the top of the question right after the poll there. All right, so kind of moving on to our next question. And this one I thought would be interesting, right? Like, what is the best way to break into the cybersecurity field? Only to see what ChatGPT would say. But leaving it to you guys first. Who wants to jump off this one?
I'll kick this one off, I guess. I'm really curious to see what ChatGPT says. I've been having a lot of conversations with people who want to get into cybersecurity and they don't know the best route. And I've always broken it down into kind of 3 different tracks. You can go the security analyst track, security engineer track, or like the inside sales track of being like a technical sales person, right? I personally think it's experience in that IT help desk type role, getting that experience, understanding, the base of what we do from a security perspective, right? So if you're in IT and you understand networking and infrastructure and servers, and if you've been in help desk and had to answer questions and track down issues and bugs and be able to talk to customers, like those 2 skill sets in themselves allow you to go either one of those routes, right? If you have that ability to investigate and find out the problem and you like doing that, that could be that analyst route. If you like the tracking on the bugs, or like you understand the network side and you can mitigate those, network or security or software-based things, maybe that's the engineering route, and then the sales route, because you can talk to customers, you can interact. So I kind of break it down to that perspective.
Okay, what do you got, Lee?
So it's interesting. No, my background is network administrator first. And I hear help desk a lot. And I understand because you got troubleshooting, you got interaction with customers. But quite frankly, I want to say, and there's going to be a super generic answer, but I'm going to say be passionate and be driven. Because I don't care what field you're trying to get into. If you just start tinkering, you're going to be successful. It's the hobbies, it's the things, the challenges that you like, that really, like, I can't wait to get off work because I'm going to go set up my server and I'm going to run the elk stack, or I'm going to figure out how to stand up a Splunk instance, right? Like, I want to see what this malware does. If you can be passionate and talk about it, how much that, like, not only brings you joy, but how much it drives you to do the things you want, whatever it is. You want to be a lawyer? Go be passionate about that. You want to be a doctor? Go be passionate about it. Like, just be passionate, continue to learn, and challenge yourself.
If ChatGPT comes up with that answer, I'm going to be very scared.
So I think Lee was pretty spot on to what ChatGPT was trying to get to. Now, remember, when ChatGPT answers, it usually gives you a list when you ask it questions that are generic, right? But I would say if you were to apply passion, the idea of Lee and the concept of passion, it applies to all the points it makes. So I'll quickly submit that up. And the points it makes is basically gain a solid understanding of the computer science fundamentals, like, operating systems, how things work, basically. Develop technical skills, so like be learning things, get certified, build a network, not like a network that you work on, but like network of people. Gain practical experience, so try to get out there, part-time jobs, internships, freelance work, whatever you can do to get like hands-on experience, and then continuously educate. So like with Lee's answer of being passionate, I feel like you would be doing all of those things. I think that's fair.
So I want to give
that's amazing.
No, that's crazy. Yeah. I'm scared now. Like I said, I'm going to get cliche, but everyone is asking about the right path. Right. What's the right path into getting into cybersecurity?
Well, no, education wasn't mentioned in there as far as like a formal school program. It was all these other things, which I thought was really interesting.
That's important.
Yeah.
People should take notice.
Yeah. And in my past, like hiring people, one of the best questions I love to ask is like, what do you do in your free time? Like, what are you passionate about? And if they're like, I have a home lab, or I love breaking down code, or I have a GitHub thing, I'm tinkering, like, I love all of those answers, and I think it just needs to trickle down into the rest of the hiring process. Because I was on Indeed helping a friend of mine kind of look through, job postings, and everything said 3 to 5+ years experience of security, blah, 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 right? And it gates you immediately, and there's so much talent out there who are driven to learn everything about this field.
Taking a step back, everything you mentioned, if you're doing those things, I think you should count that as experience.
Absolutely.
Right? Not necessarily on the job, but if you're doing it at home, like if you should count your hobbies in cybersecurity as experience.
Absolutely.
And when people ask you that question, bring it up and explain it well.
Yeah,
100%. No formal experience, but and like I said, cliche moment, don't look for the right path, look for your path.
Yeah.
Look for what drives you, where you want to go. Yeah, right. But yeah.
You're making t-shirts over there, right?
Yeah, right? I beat ChatGPT.
That's great. No, I love that.
All right, so we got a few more here. So this was interesting, and I feel like it's kind of a gimme, but we'll see. What is the most popular cybersecurity tactic used in attacks? I try to get ChatGPT technical here.
I was going to say phishing, but I'm going to say social engineering.
Okay. I went basic and went phishing. Which is a combination of social.
Now I know it's general and listening.
Right.
I'm going to say social engineering and all the above.
Let's hear what ChatGPT said, and then we can break it down a little bit.
I'm getting to the answer. It did mention social engineering and spear phishing as the answer. So I thought that, like I said.
Hey!
So it did say spear phishing was the number one thing. And I tried to look for other types of attacks, and it kind of stuck to the social engineering side of things.
Yeah, I mean, email as a vector, like we all know it. The attackers are getting very sophisticated on how they can get access to environments, right? People can craft emails that look very, 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 very similar to, things they might see in the wild, right? So if it's something from Gmail or something from Microsoft or, wherever else, it's getting crazy to see the capabilities. And again, with things like Metasploit and some of the open source frameworks that allow for the C2 and the callbacks, and then, malware as a service, like it's just going to extrapolate from that point, right? That's the easy thing to do, I feel like, is to mimic a website. The hard thing to do is to gain persistence and do all the other things that, lend to getting access to more data. But
No, I agree.
Yeah, I gotta dig that one out. I failed to copy that one over, but I know that was the answer. So I'll dig that out and throw that in there in a little bit. So yeah, I think what's interesting is, that one was kind of obvious to us as security professionals, and ChatGPT seemed to pick up on it pretty well. So the next question, what is the most desired skill in cybersecurity to try to develop? Like what skill, if you're in cyber, like what should you focus on or would help you get a job or is the most effective skill kind of thing?
I think desired, and the things that I've been seeing, again, looking through the job postings, is people are asking for people with some coding or scripting experience. I think purely for the fact that like APIs are becoming way more prevalent than they have been. So I remember working at a previous job about 2013, 2014, and helping an organization build their API against a very well-known security tool. They didn't have an API. And so because we were trying to do things programmatically, we're helping them define their API. And so now, call it 2022, 2023, every security tool typically has an API that you need to programmatically work with, or if it's intelligence streams or whatever else. I think the ability to understand how to interact with that and utilize that in your organization is kind of bubbling up as a really interesting skill set to have. And there's an interesting barrier to entry there. Like if you know the basic Python language, you can potentially communicate with those APIs because they're so well documented. And there's things like Postman, I think it's Fast API. There's a lot of really like well-defined structure around it now that it's a lot easier to interact with. So that's what I'm going with.
I'm going to say DFIR, digital forensics and incident responders. I'm going to throw SOC analysts in there as well. I may be going off old statistics, but I know when I first stepped into that realm that they said a incident responder has 1.5 to 2 year lifespan before they get burned out and move on to the next thing. Maybe not the most technically needed, but I think demand. If you're going to have that that constant rollover, I mean, you need to fill those spots, especially the incident responder spots, because if you are, actually trying to protect and mitigate for your organization, you need that, right? You need people to look at it just as much as you need the engineers. But if you're in an incident, I'm going to say that role.
Okay, so when I asked ChatGPT, it gave me a list naturally. It didn't give me one answer because it didn't want to sound wrong. But I had it sorted, and what I liked about the list, at least, is it's kind of the skill sets I feel like a well-rounded, like the list itself of what a well-rounded security professional would look like. So it didn't really give one that I thought was like, if you have this skill, you'll be the best. But it was like, if you have all these skills, you're just a desirable security professional in general. And it started out with, and I'll go ahead and get that posted. But the top of the list was threat intelligence, then it went to incident response, network security, compliance and regulation, cloud security, security automation, penetration testing, and cryptography. And I kind of like, if you're going to list those things, listing them in that order. But I when I think of, if I was going to be learning in cybersecurity to be a good professional, it would be really, really good for me to understand how to read threat intelligence, especially cyber threat intelligence, because I feel like so much of that we kind of take for granted because you get used to reading these reports and going through them and pulling important things out and knowing how to use them. But they kind of build that base for what are things that I should know or care about, or things that I need to learn just by understanding those reports in general. So I kind of liked how it kind of stuck with that.
That list is interesting because I don't feel like it should be stack ranked in that order. I think because some of those things blend into each other, right?
But I would definitely put cryptography at the bottom. I hate when people put a big emphasis on cryptography. Like, I think it's an important concept, and I think it's good to understand how to implement cryptography, like how it should be used, but how it works, that's for the mathematicians. So,
yeah, you're not typically breaking cryptography on a day-to-day basis,
yeah,
right?
you're just finding how to like side channel it or do something different in the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
I'll agree.
So moving on, this one I thought would be interesting. I was trying to figure out, because I know in cybersecurity, you kind of run into the problem where staffing is always a juggle, right? Where do you have enough people? Do you have too many people? But I wanted to focus on the leadership of cybersecurity. Like, when you have a team of people, if you're going to lead a really talented group of people, how many people can you lead effectively? So I asked ChatGPT basically, what is the most effective ratio of people to a supervisor, or that kind of level, right? To try to understand what it thinks in general, and then kind of what you guys think.
Lee?
I'm going back to the military roots.
That's where I went to.
Battalions? Nice.
4 to 6 per team. Was it 10
The
to
squad
14 per
equivalent?
squad?
There you go.
Yeah, like
Some
team to
close
squad to platoon kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, if it was effective in the military, it's probably effective everywhere else. Maybe?
What you got, Mike?
So I know industry standards typically like 8 to 10 direct reports before you have to then start building in some like middle management type roles to help scale that out. 8 reports for cyber seems like way too many. I feel like you need smaller teams to be able to communicate and work effectively, so you don't have people kind of hitting against each other as they're doing that work. And one of the things that we've seen, and I'm going to go into a little bit of a tangent, but we've seen a lot of the firings over the past couple of months in big IT organizations, and they're typically firing like the middle management type roles where it's just like this. It's you hire a guy to manage
to save money.
That guy's not doing work. It's just managing the team. So I love teams that have a working manager or somebody doing the work alongside of the other team members. So you're all in it together and you're dealing with it at the same time, right? So my answer initially was like 8 is industry standard, but specific to cyber, I feel like a team of like 5 is like perfect in my mind. Because you don't want to have a superstar that gets to a place that they just start hiring people underneath them and then they're not doing work. And then that's where you get the waste, right? So I think 4 to 5 to 6, depending on what the role is.
So ChatGPT, I'll post it real quick so everyone can read as I talk a little bit if they want. Basically said that the benchmark in general, regardless of like what the situation is, like 7 to 8 individuals, but obviously it's very dependent upon what you're supervising as far as like what field, industry, whatever that is. Because obviously there's some jobs that you can have a lot of people in one supervisor, but when I feel like when it comes to cyber, you have really talented people. And with talent, it means everyone can go in so many different directions. And you it's not like you never want to micromanage these people, but you want people working in parallel to the same objective. And that's where I feel like the team to 4 to 5 works really well. And that's kind of what it was talking about for like software development. It's kind of common to have 4 to 5 people. And you think software development, you can't have people going off the rails, because then when they develop software, all the stuff people write won't work together. Mm-hmm. And I feel like cybersecurity is kind of the same thing, right? Like you want people to be able to work together on a common thing. And so that team size is really important. And it's okay to have, and that's why I like the military. I went there, Lee, as well, right? Because team leads have 4 to 5 people under them, usually like 4, and then squads go to like 10 to 12, and then platoons is like 4 of those squads, whatever it is. And that size is, you have specialized individuals. You need to have close control of people to be able to do what they need to achieve, and also effective communication. That's something people forget about when it comes to that middle level management. Is there's a tax to communication if you want to be in the know. And senior leaders, especially in cyber, always want to know what's going on because things are always happening. And you take out that middle level management, and now you're taxing all those lower level people that have to communicate constantly and do their job. So that's something people, I think, sometimes forget about,
But I think that's the frustration, is that like the higher level management isn't in the weeds with those guys, right? So like they're asking for the reporting and the communication
directly to them.
Yeah, but they're not in the weeds doing the work with those guys. They're not in the mud, like grinding every day. Like they're just kind of like getting those reports. And so I guess, and I'll ask y'all this question from the military perspective. If you have the team of 4, you have 3 teams of 4. Those leaders of those teams, will they bubble up to a squad leader? So you have like tiers of that communication. So one person manages those teams, but the team leaders are directly, So I feel like in cyber, a lot of times it's just upper management and then everything else underneath, right? It might be one guy trying to bubble everything up, but like there's not the dissemination of those roles up.
And what's interesting is there's definitely, you got to find that line of delineation when it comes to management, I think, in cyber, where sometimes you get too top heavy because you have too many leaders that aren't part of solving the problem, right? And then that's where you run into that problem. Like, well, we don't need this leadership. They're not as effective. You got to be able to establish the leadership for who is like a technical lead and close to the people. And then you have the people that are like helping to communicate and the proper terms to the right stakeholders.
Right.
That's an important skill set and role as well. And you got to have that line somewhere in the middle so that you're effective on both sides of that line.
And I guess culture between those groups and teams, right? So like company culture or industry, like organizational culture. So like it's easier to talk about when it's a company of 25, right? But as you grow that out, those individual teams need to at least be able to get together and not have that clash of identity or ego or wherever it is and just get the job done. I feel like you always have that issue of the different, or we'll call it the different team. I know people in the chat are in the different team, but like the different team, the hunt team, the intel team, they all have their individual identities. And a lot of times they clash once they get together. And you really have to build that like culture between those team leads to make sure like they're all working.
What's interesting to me, and you mentioned that, it kind of makes me, I'm kind of going on like the military tangent, how it's organized right now that we're talking about it. But typically when I see those silos of those uniquely skilled teams with priorities and responsibilities, they go to I would call it a soft manager, and I don't use that in a negative way. They're just not a technical person. They're someone that helps orchestrate and work with people. But I feel like when you have those technical teams, it should go to a hard manager, to someone who understands the technical aspects, so they can leverage the skills of multiple teams effectively, and that bubbles up to that director almost type level. That's more of your soft manager to help facilitate. Because I feel like a lot of times there's skills when it comes to improving the security, maturity, posture, whatever of an organization. You find lapses because you have the right individuals and they're siloed in the correct way to try to be effective within their silos, but collectively they can't work well together because there's no one to help facilitate that.
Yep.
To go back to the military, there was a reason they always put a first sergeant with the company commander, right? You had a guy that was in the mud and blood. He's been there before, so that if the commander, who's just say like more of administrative leader, if they're not understanding what's going on, like you have that communication, like you were saying, the guy's like, well, this makes sense. This is what we're doing. But I don't know how many organizations follow that kind of structure where they bring in a guy that's been possibly in management all his life. He moved from manager to director to VP to CISO, and he understands cybersecurity, but he's never like actually sat down and done help desk, where he's never sat down and been an incident responder to say, this is what I remember. It's always, this is what should be, right?
I have a bunch of hot takes on that one, man. It's so frustrating when that's why I love the startup culture, because typically you're going to hire people who've been in the mud, who've done the work. They might be able to do the management side, but they know what they're talking about from the technical side and work with the teams. I love those small teams of startups. And you get into these larger organizations and you have these people who have just like, they're really good at concepts, but that doesn't always translate when you actually have to go do the work. Like I might know how to.
Everyone understands the business best practice. Not everyone understands how to implement or do the business best practice.
Right. And I go back to my baseball playing days, and I go off on a tangent, but like industries have this problem across the board. We're talking about cyber.
Mhm.
Every industry has this problem of hiring people who haven't been in the thick of things running the organization, and it's across the board. And it's huge in baseball, which stinks, right? But you have guys who are managing organizations and players and teams that have never played baseball before in their life, and that's just kind of a personal experience. But we've also seen it in cyber. We see it across the board. So yeah.
Did anyone see? So that's gonna bridge academics with real life. And don't get me wrong, academics has its place, but it's this kind of the same concept. If you spend all your time in academics where you're talking theory, you're discussing then like emerging technology, that's great. But whenever it comes to actually bridging the gap of, all right, this is how it should be, but this is how it is, they kind of miss that point. And I don't know if anyone saw the Twitter post that someone said it's out there. I believe the person was a doctorate candidate, but they said something, or take it with a grain of salt, but they said, my university is installing spyware called CrowdStrike on my laptop.
Oh yeah, I've seen that.
It's like,
Technically, I mean, you can do a lot with it.
the way it operates.
I mean, there's
Got it,
visibility, but yeah,
but it's
Technically,
not the purpose.
not a keylogger.
that's the point, right? It's
Right.
it's
Like, how are
real
you gonna make that
world.
communication? Like when you show up in your environment, you're like, we have CrowdStrike? Whoa, who's spying on us? Like, it's us.
Yeah,
Like,
Yeah, if I saw CrowdStrike, I'd be kind of excited because at least I know how the tool works, right? I'd be like, oh, cool. So we can leverage this set of things.
right.
But yeah.
take it off all the computers now.
All right, so let's move on. So the next one I think is an interesting question, and I kind of liked what ChatGPT had to say, but in your opinion, what is the hardest cyber attack technique to detect? I know.
We'll go to our resident threat hunter.
Question is, what's to a tactic instead of a technique?
Well, let me look at the answer and I'll tell you if it's more of a technique.
Because if you're doing like the miter, like
It's kind of more of a technique, but some of it, I mean, it's ChatGPT, so it's like generalized version of the techniques. It lists them, so you can try to hit something on the list. Let's be honest.
That's
And
great. It
ChatGPT
always
rules.
lists things. It's like, I don't want to be wrong, so I'm going to give you like 5.
yeah, right. In no particular
100%.
order.
But you know,
weaponize
that's what I
it.
like about it being a tool and not the authoritative thing, right? Like that way you can ask it questions and get ideas and form your own opinion, which is kind of like what we're doing now, which I think is like how it should be used, effectively. Go ahead.
Lee, you're up first, man.
Technique?
You don't have to give me like a miter idea, like just general, like what is some of the things you think would be hard to detect?
P1527.
T1059.001.
I don't know what that is. I have to look that up.
I'm gonna go to Mike because off the top of my head, I'm thinking stages of the attack, so weaponization, but I don't think that's even close to the actual answer.
It's a little
Or
more
even-
specific. It definitely is more technique-ish than that.
All right, technique most difficult to detect.
Yeah. When I read them out, you're gonna be like, oh, if you can't think of it.
I'm gonna say abuse of privileges.
Okay.
Or misuse of privileges.
Okay, Mike.
I don't know if I have a good answer for this one. I'm gonna have to default
You guys
to
it's funny because I think you guys are making it harder than it has to be.
0 days. How about that?
All right, no, there you go. All
you
right,
got?
so the techniques and the list it gave, it started out with fileless malware. Okay. Living off the land binaries are attacks. Hidden and encrypted command and control, so C2 communication. And then it talked about encryption and obfuscation, and then malicious use of legitimate protocols. So what I loved about this as it stands, and we're like, pro on the whole, like threat hunting helps with things. At least I could say 4 out of the 5 threat hunting directly addresses, right?
Which ones?
Living off the land binaries, it's something you can't build detections well off all the time. You can, sure, but not all the time. But hunting helps adjust some of that so that you can say, hey, let me see how these are being utilized as far as some behaviors I'm thinking about. Or hitting an encrypted C2, there are some analytical as far as, we talked about 3 different types of threat hunting with intelligence-driven, analytical-driven, and situational awareness. Analytical driven can help solve some of those things. Encryption obfuscation, we have ways to look for that based on how we see things being executed from a threat hunting perspective. And then malicious use of legitimate protocols. I mean, DNS tunneling is a prime example. And you can easily find that if you actually look for it. In my opinion, I don't think it's really hard to detect. You just have to know a couple things to look for and actually figure out what tools you can utilize to do that with. So that's a good example as well. So
I think the keyword is detect. And then that thing's alerts, detections versus hunting and seeing.
Identify. So that leads us to what we're going to next.
Oh, I was gonna say, in this list, like, what are the kind of easiest or hardest to detect in this list then, in y'all's minds?
So I had it sorted what I thought would be the hardest. The
hardest to easiest?
So yeah, the hardest is at the top, and that's how chat's sorted it. I kind of have a bit like fileless malware. I feel like, yes, it's hard, but if you're using common techniques to do fileless malware, it's kind of easy to detect. That's kind of where I stand. But there's like different ways to try to leverage that can be kind of sneaky. The living out the land binaries, I would kind of say can be very hard if you don't know what you're looking for or you don't understand some things. So like the level of difficulty with some of these is really more about where is your expertise and familiarity. It's a hard word for me to say right now, apparently. So it's probably the Cyber Sentinel. I don't know.
It's a Sentinel getting
but yep. But yeah, I feel like these aren't impossible. The ones that are more analytical based obviously are harder to solve. There's either skills or tool sets you might not have. The ones that don't rely on analytics, like from the network traffic perspective, I feel like you should be able to come up with.
I want to say that actually might be, well, I'm going to say second easiest. Because think about encryption and
But what's weird is it's the most commonly used though. Like if you look at this list and say what are the most commonly used attacks that you see, it's weird that we would say yes, these agreeably are. We can say which ones we can detect well, but they're so overly used, so either we're not looking for them the correct way or whatever, right? Like
it all depends.
We address these on a day-to-day.
If the threat actor is good and they're living in your space for a while and they're looking at your logs and like figuring out what's going on, they could blend in a lot easier. But if no one ever uses net local group or AD find or there's like common
it should stand out if you're looking for it, right?
Then that might stick out. Or I think you even taught me this. If you're looking at a server and you see a bunch of lull bins kicking off that don't normally do it, I mean, that could be an easy win, right? Saying like, well, why is the domain controller trying to figure out what's going on the domain controller?
Well, it's kind of like we've talked about it before, but I think that's why profile hunting is important.
Yeah.
Right. Especially for environments that are more or less static or process specific. That way you're basically saying, oh yeah, this shouldn't change much. So let's profile it in some way based on behaviors we know that would be malicious, and we know what we can effectively detect if we want to put detections in place or hunt for. Yeah, so I feel like we should jump to the shadow AI.
Ooh,
you guys are up for that. So something we dubbed shadow AI, and it's basically because
copyright, by the way.
we're definitely. We basically, it's kind of people have heard of shadow IT and how people have used different resources and things to either do their job or not do their job, depending on what it is. I kind of look at ChatGPT as something similar, or we do, where you can help it perform some of the things you want to do on your job, or it can distract you very easily because it's easy to get on that rabbit hole. But we have 13 things that we have kind of identified or agreed on as helpful things that we can see helping us on the day-to-day using ChatGPT and the strength of it. We always hear all these articles that talk about, oh, ChatGPT can write all this malware and do all these offensive things. Well, let's kind of flip it. Let's talk about how does a security practitioner utilize ChatGPT to make their day easier or their investigations response easier and those types of things. So with that, I believe, Lee, you got the first topic, to learn a new security topic.
So looking at the way people learn, right? Back in the day, all books, education, academics, then, like YouTube came out. And I was like, oh, I could learn this real quick. Then TikTok came. And you have the TikTok taught me. where you can see it in 30 seconds or less. Now you have ChatGPT, where you don't have to sift through documentation. You could ask for a simple topic that you want, and the outputs that you get even give you an example. Because before I came here, I always wanted to know what a keylogger looked like and what DNS tunneling and like a beacon looked like. I never had the resources to make that happen. So when I came here, I was like, we got the lab, let's play around. So, you know, I've messed around with keyloggers, and it was fun to sit there and watch, right? But before that, if I wouldn't have had this opportunity, ChatGPT would have been great, because then you could actually see, like, you have it right there, SQL injection. What does that look like? I know, you know, it's using the language, it's using the drop table, the 1 - 1, you know, or 1 = 1, etc. But what does that look like? Reading from a book, and then actually seeing it implemented, completely different things, and you get the answer like that. So I really think it's gonna be a quick win. It's gonna be surface knowledge. So the one thing I do warn you about is, if you want to see what that looks like, figure out or get this answer from ChatGPT, then dive into that. Don't just sit there and say, oh yeah, I'm good now. It's all right. Well, we see what it looks like. This is, you know, here's an example. What's the impact? Because I don't think ChatGPT will probably give you a general list of impact, but to actually figure out what's going on afterwards and what that means, that's when you're actually gonna have to like dig up. But this will get you in the right place and moving in the right direction. So I'm not mad.
I think what's really cool is you can quickly, when you hear buzzwords, attacks, reading something or whatever, and you're like, gosh, I'm not really quite sure what that is, how that works. What's nice about ChatGPT is you can get to explain it kind of like you see the, you know, SQL injection. But even if that's like too high or too low level for you, you can try to tell it, can you explain it to me like I have no idea what any of these things are? And it does a pretty good job of, you know, quote unquote, dumbing things down to a level where you can say, okay, now I get the concept. Now I can really gravitate to what are the technical things you're talking to. So I think that part's really cool with ChatGPT. We're just trying to learn security on the fly, and, you know, with whatever you're dealing with in the day-to-day.
Previous to this, you'd have to do research to say, okay, what is SQL injection, right? Give me some examples. And typically you could Google that and you can look it up. Executing that in an environment where you were able to learn like what it actually did was probably a little bit more difficult. Building your data sets. This does break it down nicely. I wonder, and this is probably good for people who learn in a way that like everything's broken down to you without having to do the work physically to do the work, or to try and kind of that failure, try, fail, try, succeed type process. It's interesting though, like for it to break down the logic and understand how to then explain it to you in a specific way, I think is going to be huge for people who have very different ways of learning. And that's the key to this, I feel like, right? Like I am more of a try and fail and figure it out type of person, where like somebody might be able to break it down and see the problem, the answer, and the formula and how you got there, and then understand it, almost like math or like algebra or calculus or something like that, right? And so I feel like it's doing that from a call it like a math class perspective, where you're going to get the information, it's going to show you the answer, and it's going to work backwards. But it's going to be interesting to see where this evolves to it giving you a prompt and be like, try it out on this random data set that we built and see the results, right? That would be really cool for me.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think
kind of almost like your like quick emulation.
Right.
So to go around what you're saying, Mike, is I think I've always been a very visual learner. I need to see it. I need to see how it's working. To be fair, like I'm not I've never really programmed stuff outside of academics because that's just difficult for me. Like I don't know, like I can set variables, but it's like, well, what is this going to look like? And then I run it and I get error. It's like, oh, well, that's not. But
that's when the fun begins.
And I think that's why I think that's why I gravitated to where I am now, because the logs are my visualization, right?
The truth, right? Yeah.
And you can say like
your log food.
Right. It's just like, boom, here it is. This is what happened. And then this helping out even more is just like, well, here's what it looks like. Here, it's just, I don't know, visual learner. It helps out a lot.
Well, so check out this next technique, right?
This
So
is also
one of the
scary.
things I wanted to hit on was, I don't know if people have ever tried to deobfuscate or de-encode any kind of malicious scripts and stuff that have come across. The example I threw up there in the Discord chat, it's basically a PowerShell encoded and slightly obfuscated script from a real threat report. And what was cool was it basically was telling me kind of how it was encoded, describe some of the key features initially, and then I just basically kept prompting it. It's like I talked about having to need to pivot, force ChatGPT to do exactly what you want it to do. So I was like, can you decode this? And then it decoded it, where it kind of showed me what it was, but they were still base 64 encoded material stored in a variable. And I was like, hey, that variable there, can you decode that? And sure enough, it pulled everything out, explained the variables, what the variables were doing. And I thought this was a very effective way to possibly address some things you might see quickly. Like if you see something, because sometimes, for one, if you get threat intelligence reports, they might pull out, oh, there was this embedded macro and this was the macro. They don't like actually decode it for you, and they just kind of throw it in there as if like, just so you know, if you want to detect. Well, now you can actually decode those types of things and actually find other artifacts you might care about, especially some of the encoding stuff. If you're looking for just straight detections and IOCs, you can pull out domains, IPs, and things like that as well. But by either looking at threat reports or things you're actively investigating, I thought this was just a nifty thing. I remember using CyberChef or other types of means, and depending on what OS you're looking to decode base 64, but there's multiple different types of encoding. I haven't stress test what ChatGPT is capable of, but it's pretty cool that it can take something that has obfuscation, encoding, multiple encoding, and just kind of break it down and go through it. And it took me 60 seconds. So.
Because I like how it says, as I mentioned earlier, this script is potentially harmful, and I would advise against
it already doesn't like it.
So my question is, does it understand the code and what it does? Or does it say it's potentially harmful because of the context that it was in? Like if this was from an intel report.
I think it's got enough malicious things that it's probably seen before and that were flagged as malicious based on the context that it read through these things. So when I see something like this, the relationships between the strings and characters, kind of how language models kind of work together, it's like, God, this kind of matches a similar pattern to those types of things, is my guess.
Yeah, again, you got to realize this is all human, well, not human. The model is reinforced, right? So it's probably something that it's seen before. Like Scott, you said, I'm curious if we fed it some 0-day type of thing that it probably wouldn't necessarily. It might be like, that looks bad, but it wouldn't.
Might not be. It might be cautious, but not as blatantly harmful.
Right. It probably is saying if something's encoded and it runs IEX and then also does this thing, it's probably bad. So it's probably just like these flags or modifiers saying this thing's probably bad, right? But for it to be like, hey, this could be bad, that's interesting.
Oh yeah, still very helpful.
A great
100%.
tool to have in your toolkit for just stuff.
And did this help you? Like if you were doing an IR type engagement, would this have been like, oh, sweet, now I know how to go?
I remember starting out and getting not encrypted, but encoded and obfuscated things. And there were some people that were really good at just kind of reversing some of the variables and having it output the things for them by running the malicious stuff, but making it benign based on the last execution. And I didn't know how to do that at the time. So I was like, God, how do these people deobfuscate and decode this stuff? And then I kind of learned how to do it the hard way, where I was actually doing it myself and not having it execute to do it for me. So there was multiple iterations of learning patterns trying to mature to where I could understand how to cope with these things. And this is just great. If you're day one analyst and this is what you have as a resource, you can accomplish so much more than I could day one.
Does this absolutely jack up CTFs in the future?
Ooh, I don't know. It's a good question.
Right?
Especially if it has if they give it access to the internet, can it then reference other CTFs that try to do the similar things? I mean, that's interesting. Will they have to not allow chat GPT type stuff? Yeah.
I don't know. It's a question. Let's ask ChatGPT what it thinks about dominating CTFs in the future.
In the CTF yet?
It can be a contender.
Yeah. So I guess I'm up next.
Yep.
We're going to take a step back, like 5 steps, right? I think we've talked about this before, but just understanding basic concepts and being able to prompt and be like, hey, I need to understand the difference between a detection or a hunt or a detection and identification. Again, with its ability to summarize and sum those different concepts and give you a prompt that is educational, is again, it absolves the complexity of you going out and searching that stuff independently to say, I need to understand what a detection is, I need to understand what a identification is, and then coming to that conclusion on your own. The thing that I think bothers me with some of this is like that ability to deduce this stuff on your own is really important in my mind. So it's one thing to say like, give me the answer, and it's one thing to build the answer on your own. And I just worry about the skill set of analysts and engineers and cybersecurity people over time, where things are going to be very, very easy for them. And then what happens when that's not available to them, or that answer isn't necessarily adjacent to what they're trying to solve? You're gonna lose that like logical kind of ability to like figure out the problem on your own based on these prompts. And so this kind of brought up that in my mind to say it's going to be easier for a lot of people, right?
It gives you the answer.
One of the things that
context, but you have to have the understanding of what it means.
Yeah, that's what I was going to kind of try to touch on. Was you make a kind of a good point, is this is really effective for us with experience. Like we get there's like with this specific question, we get there's a difference, and we kind of have an idea, understanding what that difference is. This kind of spells it out where we can kind of say, yeah, so I would draw similar distinctions and things like that because of our own experience and the information we're getting. Now, if you have no experience and you're going off this information, it kind of becomes that regurgitation game. Like you really didn't learn anything. You just know how to memorize, hey, this is this and this is that, right? And so I think you can kind of run into that problem. And that's kind of similar to when you see people come out of academia though, right? There's you get some experience, but there's a lot of regurgitation that comes because you're just kind of learning a lot really quick. Or certification, same thing, a lot really quick. So I feel like you have a similar challenge there, but what I think is nice about ChatGPT is it's more flexible than the other two, because you can ask it questions off the rails or on other topics that might not get touched on. Like that, the access there for information is more indefinite than that of those other resources. But what I liked about this too is, we struggle with this from a when we write our content, we try to be very clear with our terminology and say we're identifying something versus detecting something. And we try to make that clear distinction, because when we look at detections, they're more like that alert driven, process driven type thing versus identification. There's context around driving that. And I think that's kind of an important thing for people to understand when they think about threat hunting versus just doing SOC detection analyst type work. They're kind of two different things.
I think I see, and I'm kind of looking at it from like the programmatic or developer standpoint, where I've seen things like Copilot with GitHub, and this kind of lends into the next thing we're going to talk about with Lee on the simple programming help. But if it prompts you and just tells you the thing, and you don't understand the core concepts of that thing, just like when people will go out to Stack Overflow and be like, all right, I have a problem, I'm just going to copy code in, and now it runs, but you don't understand how it's running and why it's doing that. I feel like we're going to get to that place where it's just going to be that this is the thing, right? We're just going to put this in place. It runs. I don't need to know why it's doing what it's doing, and we're going to lose a lot of the core concepts of the understanding of, just like there's not a lot of Fortran programmers and COBOL programmers anymore that are touching the ones and zeros. We're all abstracted above that, and we're going to keep moving higher and higher up that scale. We don't care about the ones and zeros in the computer architecture and translating Python into machine language. It's just going to be like these higher level concepts as we start to utilize these tool sets. So,
well, I know we've seen that.
The last Highlander.
It can only be one.
We've seen that with network engineering, where it's like software defined networks.
Yep.
And the real true network engineers, like people can spin up a network really fast and make it work really well. And then when there's an issue and you have to look at the PCAP, they're like, well, I don't know how to do that. Like I can build huge networks, but when I have to troubleshoot at the PCAP level, you got to pull out the senior guy that's all bearded and, been there for 30 or 40 years. He's like, you don't want to look at
He's
PCAP.
like, oh, is it my time?
Yeah.
Back end.
Right.
My brother is one of those guys that knows Fortran and does mainframe computing, and like there's a small skill set around that. It's going to be interesting when we get to our senior, like if we're in this for another 20 years, like we're going to be the guys that are like, oh yeah, I can read that PCAP, or I know how to troubleshoot that network or that code, right? And these there's already a trend to no code, low code, XYZ. There's companies like Airtable and things like that you can connect the databases and just put the blocks in place and things work, where you don't have to understand literally anything about programming. And we're just going to continually like abstract out those layers, and where there's going to be that skill set of individuals like us and who've been in the game for a while that will know how to actually operate. So
I think the biggest separator is going to be experience. And I think you've all touched on it, but this is quick knowledge, it's quick context, quick understanding of it, but all surface layer, like I said before. But if you're not in it and you're not understanding the implications, or if you're not experienced enough, like I forget which, it was a Darknet Diary, and these guys were planning.
Great podcast.
Oh yeah, cute, love it.
Darknet Diary. Yeah.
Free plug. So like they're talking about monitoring ISIS in the Middle East, and these guys spent like years studying the people, the main people that were involved, and they're like, we're actually going to attack now. So they started attacking, and they were trying to bring down the ISIS media network, and they ran to a wall, and they're like, well, this guy has a password. He's like, we don't know his password. How do we not? And I think one of the analysts was like, or the story goes, he said 1515, and they're like, well, why 1515? He's like, well, I've been studying this guy. I've been trying to understand who he is, what he does, how he, what makes him function. And it's always 1515, which if you type it out, it looks like ISIS, right? That level of understanding.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's awesome.
But that's what this is missing, right? And that's what's going to separate the juniors from the seniors to the principals, is that how far I'll say it, like how far did you go with ChatGPT? Did you use it to answer questions and get quick wins, or did you use it to start a journey of understanding and experience? So
yeah, and I think what we're saying is like,
I feel
it's
like
tool, but it's not the thing that's going to define you, right? It can pass the bar.
I don't know anything in cybersecurity. There's nothing in cybersecurity that replaces anyone. Like they're all tools, and unfortunately, like they don't get marketed as it's just tools. They get marketed as solutions, right? But anyone that has worked in here long enough knows that, yeah, there's some better tools out there, but ultimately, like you got to know how to implement and use the tool effectively. Otherwise, it really has no value. But then it's nowhere close to a solution. But yeah, ChatGPT, I think similar.
Yep.
What else we got? I think Lee, you're up with the programming help.
So funny enough, I was actually going to take it this way. I think this is a perfect segue into it, because like I said, I picked this because I'm not a very good programmer. It's all been academic. I wish I would spend more time, trying to figure it out. But if you sit there and you can, once again, we're going to go back to the experience and the understanding and the implications of this. It's great. It's a great tool to get a quick understanding or a quick bit of code from it. And I feel bad because we just said everything. Like, well, once everyone starts learning here, right?
Sorry.
We'll just nudge that up. No, but one thing I will say is, if this is trained and everyone is asking the same questions, how do I program this? How do I program this? And then you start getting these developers, right? You start getting all the same code, right? And we mentioned earlier that ChatGPT is really good at regurgitating what already exists. What it's not good at is the creative mindset. And hear me out. It can produce a poem for you by Dr. Seuss about whatever topic you want, right? And it could be new, the poem could be new, but it's not really creative thought. It's taking a Dr. Seuss model and applying it applying what it knows of a topic to it versus coming up with actually something new and creative. So yes, we could get a bunch of mass-produced programmers that know how to make the code because they've asked ChatGPT, they've copy and pasted. But when it comes to creating like a modular program and how things have to function and call each other, and what happens if this breaks? What's your backup? That's the higher level application of it, if that makes sense. Like I said, we can always ask it to, how do I look at this? What does this look like? And boom, here it is. But implementing it into a complete solution is going to be different.
So one of the things I've had success with that I do like, so I do a lot of like random coding. I do some video encoding type stuff sometimes. I use FFmpeg or FFprobe, and I know you can do like command line, like automation type things. And sometimes I can use ChatGPT to say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm using this tool. What flags do I use? What are things? And it gives me a good structure to start from, which is really cool. And one of the things I also like as well is if I write, like I do code from time to time, and I can kick out a bunch of code and I can make something work, but I know based on how I kicked it out, I wasn't really focusing on what's the best way to do it, to optimize it, that kind of thing. And I'll take blurbs of code and throw it in there and say, this is what I've got. This is what it's trying to do. Can you optimize it? And it will give me really good suggestions for, hey, you might want to use this versus this, or structure it this way. And I thought that was a really interesting, for like simple coding, to kind of help out for those types of things. But I do feel like every time I've interacted with ChatGPT for coding, I've had to like push it in the direction I want to go. Like it'll give me something, I'm like, not quite what I'm looking for. Can you take that and then do this with it? And like have like multiple iterations, and then I end up with something pretty cool. But it's not like this example is kind of out of the gate because it's a simple question. But I feel like when you actually give code and want to have that conversation back and forth, you do kind of push and nudge, and then you kind of formulate what you got. So
there are companies that are built around ChatGPT and some of these models where they're saying, give me a iOS app that does customer onboarding for XYZ, and it'll spit out the app. And so we're going to see coding as a commodity. We're going to see coding become, to your point, like less creative. Like there's a standard around building a SaaS app to do XYZ, especially if the code's out there, right? Like there's a way to do it. Like I need an app that allows for SSO, for login. It's a database that stores user accounts for XYZ, that gives you the ability to input these things, and they can spit that out, right? There's no creativity behind that. That is a kind of a tried and true method of doing that thing. And that is only going to like increase over time. So those type of apps, the iOS apps, the SaaS apps, all that's going to be commodity in the future, right? And then it's how you just differentiate off of that to build that next new thing. But over time, that's also become commodity if that code base is in the wild and exploitable via these models that can learn and train off of those things. Not trying to be like super depressing about it, but like that's just the way it's going to go. And ChatGPT hired a bunch of engineers and coders to train these models recently. It's going to get better.
There could be pros and cons of that though, right? Like if ChatGPT can produce secure coding practices, so standardize all the things that create all the numerous bugs that create problems for us in our industry based on, you're going to be buying software that's going to be coded and you hope someone codes it correctly. That human error aspect might come out, like the creativity and the capability might not be what we can possibly create. So there could be some advantages from like that templating type portion.
But what happens when that 0 day comes out to that template and then everybody's affected?
Yeah, no, that's the problem, right? Like that's like, how do you guarantee it's right? Yeah, so that was my next thing is like, but then if it produces the wrong thing, that's a bigger problem. So
yeah. It's going to be interesting to see where this goes though. Go ahead, Lee.
I was going to ask you, Scott, did you ask it, one, if it can write secure code? Two, can you input insecure code into it and say, can you take use it as code review and say, can you tell me if this is secure or insecure?
I didn't try that, but that would be really cool. I know like it does with some of the security controls. Try not, like, you've got to be really careful how you word things because it's trying really hard not to write security issue related stuff because it doesn't want to have this reputation of there's been so many things that have hit the media about how it's going to, make attackers the brilliant attackers they are today. So they put a lot of constraints around getting malicious things or insecure things through it.
I'd be curious if it
But yeah, I haven't tried.
call it Python code. You say, I want to import log4j version, the exploitable version, and see if it says like, don't do that, right?
You use the term exploit, it usually will give you an error kind of thing.
Right.
You have to like force.
But no, just importing code, like make this more secure, and you say at the top, be like import log4j, whatever version it is, and see what happens. Right?
I did see a lot of the respected talking heads on like Twitter and LinkedIn said, I think I've seen a couple whenever this blew up. Well, I'll use talking heads as respect. I didn't mean to disrespect by that, but a lot of the main key players, I think a lot of them said don't use it for code review, and I was like, well, why not? What's the harm there? Now I get it. If it's proprietary, you don't want to be putting proprietary stuff.
I think it's not, probably because it's not built for it, for one. And two, if you're going to do something for code review, then you're saying you're basically going to trust something that's not built for code review. And so you're kind of putting like, hey, if it passed this, it's good. And that might not be, that'd be a false sense of security kind of perspective of how I look at it, at least.
Yeah, I mean, you can do things like version numbers against code bases that have CVEs. Like that's easy to do, right? Like if I'm importing some package that has a known vulnerability, like it could spit out, yes, don't do that. Now, if I'm writing something that does like authentication for JWT that has some sort of vulnerability, or I'm patching something in plain text from a security standpoint on a login and it doesn't know the context and it misses that, and you're like, oh, well, ChatGPT said it was cool, we're good, right? Like there's some implications there, but it's all about risk. So if you get popped and you're like, well, ChatGPT looked over my code, like that's not going to pass right now, right? It could be eventually, but that's not going to be the route out of having to pay a lot of money. So.
All right, so we're kind of getting closer on our timetable here. So do you want to kind of speed around some of these last ones, kind of just to say a few points on what we think?
We can kind of go through the list that we have right now and see what ones are kind of hot topics.
I do like your next one. I do think that's really cool.
System configuration.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have one on system configuration. In the example, we asked it the bind configuration for private and public. Again, I think this is a very, very cut and dry example of how ChatGPT can help, because it's a well-defined, structured, documented thing that I don't have to go bounce around to different websites to understand how to implement this properly. It gives me the answer. And so one of the first things it says in the list, though, is like install and configure bind on your operating system or your DNS server. I could probably prompt it again to be like, I need bind installed on Ubuntu 2204, and it would tell me exactly what to do, and then I can move on past there. It's all the same things I would do in Google, explained to me in a list of things. I could actually like copy this out and throw it in my OneNote documentation and be like, look, this is how you do this thing. And I'll have to deal with the documentation, right? That's awesome for me. And I don't know if you could prompt it to say like, I need these servers configured, and it would change the code base that's there. That's something we haven't touched base on, but this is great for, again, everything we've talked about around that, the base knowledge of a thing.
Think about standing up a lab.
Right, 100%.
You want to stand up a lab quick? Like you could just say, I need to build these few things. These are my requirements for what I want. How do I configure these things? Like, I just feel like that is, like, I don't think you should configure your enterprise this way. It might be a good resource to bounce ideas.
Right.
But gosh, like I think we've all built labs or played in labs. Like I think this is, and usually the biggest challenge is like, I've never done this before because I'm standing up something I don't have a lot of experience with. It's not my forte. I now can stand up a DNS server, no problem. Or I now can configure a switch, no problem, if I don't have those skills. I think it's really cool.
So have you, and this brings up, everything I think you mentioned in that conversation was open source, or you could do open source, correct?
Well, you can find this on the web, but it just takes on more work, I think.
Well, I mean, like the technologies that were involved, like Linux.
Oh, yeah.
Now,
Sure.
what if you ask it a specific tool that is normally like you have to have a license for it, or you have to purchase the tool itself?
Yeah, it might be the documentation's available
Yeah,
or
so
not.
like, yeah, so like a security tool, and I'm trying to think of any that have gated documentation.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to get the response on that. Like, how do I configure
Right.
X firewall to do this thing? It
Exactly.
probably won't tell you, right? Because it doesn't have that data set.
I was gonna say that would be interesting if it did have that data set.
Well, that'd be
But
scary.
what's cool when you think about well, so if you think about a lot of like security solutions in general, like the point you make, if it doesn't give you the exact answer, but it gives you something similar, a lot of stuff kind of functions the same way, may use a couple of terminology, word differences or whatever, but it might get you on the right path. So, I think a win's a win when you think of things like that.
I was thinking about bridging that gap of experience with resumes. Like you look at it like, hey, you need 5 years Cisco experience. It's like, well, I've never dealt with Cisco. What does that look like? Boom. Yeah.
Real quick, just on like resume writing and like mapping to the industry that you want, like you input the resume that you have and be like, write this for a cybersecurity role for a tier 1 analyst, and have it spit out and like map the things that you're good at, the things that you should have experience with as a tier 1 analyst in cybersecurity would be amazing. It's an amazing, like, and I probably shouldn't say it. I hope nobody is going to build this product off of this, right? But like, that's an amazing opportunity that I think, a lot of places could potentially use, because there's skill sets that align with both sides that
Well, that's exactly
ChatGPT or AI could manipulate into that thing. Cut that. We'll save that for ourselves.
That's exactly. Well, I was gonna say, like when I had the thing where writing mundane things, that's exactly what I had to do, which was kind of cool. Basically, write that all out for me.
Ironically, so I know, side tangent too. The class I'm in right now is actually the task was you create a business, and your job is to pitch a adoption of a new emerging technology. I picked ChatGPT because we're here, right? It's easy. If it's all in your face, and a bunch of research, reading articles, peer reviews, all that stuff. And I know this is kind of like a side tangent, but it said, as much as knowledge as this produces, you shouldn't be worried that it's going to reduce the amount of jobs out there, because it still needs human aspects of completing a task, and that's the input, but it's also the experience of the implementations. Like we've been doing all night long, we've just feeding it, and it's just been put and output. If you have no idea what to do with that output, that's on you, but it's not going to do that for you yet.
Yeah.
Just an interesting side note.
So, Lee, I want you to touch on this next one, and then maybe we'll close out on that one too. The operationalized information piece.
So, listen, I haven't mastered it yet, but this could make that job a lot easier. Whenever I take an Intel report, the first thing I like to do is identify IOCs right out the gate, right? Your IPs, your hashes, domain names, throw that all to one side, and then say, all right, well, what are the behaviors we're looking for? And that comes into comes into light with the command line arguments, the parameters that are used, the relationships of the processes that are kicking off. I feel like this would be great if it could ingest that and make those two separate layers, just make that job a lot quicker. But also,
it used to be really good. I was going to say, it used to be really good when you were able to feed it a lot of input, to say, summarize this threat report, but also say, give me all the technical information from this threat report. And it would pull and actually distinctly pull those out, but it has that input limitation now that prevents some of that. But sorry.
Well, no, that's fine. But what I really like about this though is if it did do that, it provides context. And I know I probably said it on multiple podcasts. I probably said it tonight, but context is king. Just the item, and just like in an instant response or threat hunting, an event is an event, right? You find a log, that's it's a log. But if you have the understanding of what happened before it, what happened next, or at least have the understanding of where to go, that context is what will actually make everything make sense. And that's why, ChatGPT providing that context So you can get that quick understanding of, oh, well, what if this happens? What if it's not in the right spot? What if it's spelled differently? You know, where does it normally live? Information right there. And then you can immediately say, oh, so, you know, when logon.exe running out of the temp folder is not normal. Okay, cool. I know what to look for next. So
I think the next couple of months to a year is going to be very interesting for this. There's probably going to be a lot of cease and desists out there. The robocrawling, a lot of organizations are going to be very upset because this data that came back from what you spit out is coming from a private website.
Talking about the SSPI call?
The response, like where they're getting the information from, is probably from an organization or a website that has that data that they took a lot of time and effort to present on their website that was crawled by ChatGPT. And so a lot of the argument today is that there is a copyright framework or law saying that, like, if you divert the ability to make money or to not prosper, there's another term for that, but basically
profit.
You're taking eyes off of the derivative works of that website. So let's call it, maybe Microsoft has this on their website, and now ChatGPT is presenting this, but you don't get the clicks in the eyes on Microsoft anymore because you're just going to go to ChatGPT. That's going to piss off Microsoft.
It resolves.
Right? And so there's going to be these lawsuits, and these things are going to happen the next couple months that I think are going to affect the data sets of ChatGPT. And so the things over time in the next couple of years, the values are going to come from that data set. So if you have a great data set of information, you're going to make a lot of money, because that's where you can put blocks on crawls on your website, right? Like we'll probably do that for ours.
Yeah.
In Hunter, right? Like if you can't log in, you can't see all our hum packages and the things that we produce. The really big interesting one is so like Yelp, right? If I say, what is the best steak restaurant in Richmond, Virginia, and it spits out the results, I now don't go to Yelp. I now have no ability to click the ads or get the viewership on Yelp. They don't get the pass-through money. They don't get the Google ad like representation, and they lose money off of that. So they're gonna sue. And so I think this
Google has an advantage because it doesn't do that. It makes you go to the
doesn't.
site.
Because they have ad sharing, because they pay out 70% of their revenue on the ad sharing. So there's going to be an inflection point with ChatGPT where it's going to lose a lot of their data sets, and they're going to have to pay a boatload of money to get those data sets back to be even somewhat reliable on the responses that they send back. Lee, yeah, something, yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting.
The solution to that, and I've noticed that when we've been talking about ChatGPT and looking at the responses, the easiest solution to that, I believe, and if ChatGPT is listening, you're welcome, is the same way to get out of plagiarism in school. Cite your source, and you can say, here's the answer.
Yeah.
This
it might be tough for the model to have like 100 sources, but yeah.
But so think about this though, you're still going to have to end up paying for that source. You can cite it all day, but that source is going to be like, if you want this data, you're going to have to pay X amount of money to get this data out.
But is it cheaper than a lawsuit?
No.
No, okay.
I don't think so over time.
Yeah, me.
Yeah, I don't think so over time. So like, there's a really cool example, and I'm trying to remember, like Apple pays for a data set explicitly. So I think it's Google is built into Apple's search for like Safari, and they pay like billions of dollars a year for that access, right? For that data set for search, right? So there's this like other marketplace underneath all this that's going to happen, which is going to be really interesting. But I mean, if you have a security data set of knowledge and understanding, like if we have the threat hunting lexicon and we control that and we sell that over to ChatGPT, like that's what they're going to have to do over time, right?
So being kind of the end of the session here, I think we should try to wrap this thing up. I think it's been a really fun conversation. We have, obviously have some other ChatGPT things we can share, and we might add those kind of to some of the things down the road. But we have a poll too as well. If you partook in the Cyber Sentinel, It was kind of a sweet whiskey drink, at least the way I made it. So it was kind of fun. Let us know what you think. Next time, the drink will be the Crypto Cooler. It'll be a rum-based drink. Yeah, maybe it'll be good. Before we kind of sign off of here, I just want to make a few call-outs and mentions. For really good information, if you like the stuff you hear here, there's some other things that'll be available as well. First, there'll be the Overwatch, the Threat Hunting Management Workshop. This is just going to really talk about some threat hunting program type aspects, what they look like, measures, capabilities, best practices, industry standards. Something you should really look into. It's really good for, I think, a team to understand what a program should look like, as well as if you're going to be leading a team or your management, wants to get a grasp on what that could look like, definitely check that out. Second, traditionally, we always have those threat hunting workshops with hands-on experience with Lee Arkanal. This one will be Lateral Movement. That one will be a lot of fun. He's going to be covering down on those. Got really good feedback. There's a CTF-like challenge at the end. Please partake in that. And, with that, everyone, thanks for joining us. We love talking shop with friends and colleagues. Please, if you like what you hear here, check us out on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts in general, and leave a good review. It helps us get discovered so that more people will partake. And we also have our weekly podcast that we do for, 5 topics usually on news, intelligence reports, technical write-ups that we will dive into on Wednesday. So check that out as well. So all we have here, so happy hunting from our side. Lee, Mike.
Great combo. Love it. Hope you all learned something and can't wait for the next one.
Take care, everyone.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the Out of the Woods podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss an episode. For more information or to connect with Cyborg Security, check us out online at www.cyborgsecurity.com and follow us on social media. We'll see you next time.